Monsters are real. Ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win.
Unlike the image of a villain in pop culture, where it's usually clear from the very first shot that this is evil, in the real world, criminals often aren't that different from you and me. We can greet a sweet old lady for years, visit our family doctor, or just have a beer with a friend and never even suspect what skeletons they have in their closets or how many there are. Let's find out now. My name is Sasha, and even considering the topics of previous videos, today is probably the creepiest episode of your favorite show. Spain, Tenerife, the city of Santa Cruz. On December 22, 1970, someone knocked on the door of Walter Tanzler, a local doctor. He wasn't in a hurry to open the door because just a few days ago he had hired a new maid, a young German woman named Sabina. And that actually was her job. But Tanzler, who was standing right by the entrance, hesitated before finally deciding to open it himself. There were two people standing on the doorstep, a middle-aged man and a very young guy. After greeting the host, they introduced themselves as relatives of Sabina the maid. The older one, Harold Oleksandr, was her father, and the younger one, Frank Oleksandr, was her brother. Despite looking a bit confused and having some dirt on their hands, the visitors appeared quite respectable and inspired trust. So Mr. Tanzler invited them into the living room and called the girl. So as not to disturb the family's conversation, the man stepped into the next room. It was just a common courtesy since he could still hear what they were talking about from there. At first it was just greetings and an exchange of the usual "how are you?" But within a minute, the content of the conversation made Tanzler cautiously peek into the living room. He couldn't believe what he heard, and it frightened him greatly. But not as much as the reaction of his maid Sabina. Trembling with fear, the doctor quietly returned to his room, locked himself in, and called the police. In a whisper, so as not to attract attention, he asked them to send someone to his house immediately. The man was more frightened than he had ever been before, or ever would be again. What he heard, what Harold Oleksandr told his daughter, would soon be called the crime of the century. But to understand exactly what the Oleksandr family did, what Harold told his daughter and why, we will have to go back in time by 170 years because, strangely enough, this whole story began back then. In the cheerful town of Kanisha, in what is now Slovenia, Jacob Lorber was born, a man directly connected to that very crime of the century. However, not the one in which he lived. Little is known about the early years of Lorber's life, except that the boy had remarkable musical talent and studied the violin. Lorber was a genius of his time. Niccolo Paganini. The same one, if that name means anything to you. I hope it does, so Jacob really did, as they say, know his way around the violin. He even performed at the La Scala Opera House in Milan. And that's, believe me, really impressive. Even today, it was a real breakthrough. And there's more. In 1840, Mr. Lorber was offered the position of assistant music director at the theater in the city of Trieste, Italy. However, something made Jacob turn down this offer, or rather someone, and you will never believe who? Jesus Christ. At least that's what the man himself said. The thing is, after his 40th birthday, Jacob began to hear an inner voice that whispered various thoughts to the violinist. In fact, giving up his career as a musician and starting to live in solitude was advice from that voice. Jesus. Again, according to Mr. Lorber, it was always his voice. Most of the advice Jacob heard was about faith and what God is actually saying. Over the next 24 years, he collected about 10,000 printed pages of this message from God. The man's works were published posthumously as a new revelation, and unfortunately, they became a source of inspiration for the creation of a pseudo-religion, a religion that would later in the 20th century be preached in Germany by members of the new Salem society. Its members believed that a person could achieve the level of God's perfection if they followed the concept of self-denial. That is, to limit themselves in earthly pleasures, to pray constantly, and of course to keep rereading Lorber's writings. None of them really had a personal life. After all, these people also believed that the whole world outside their community was pure evil. As the New Salem Society, the community existed only from 1921 to 1937. Then it was banned, dissolved by the National Socialists, and reassembled after World War II under the new name Lorber Society. In the early 1950s, the leader of this ultra-religious society, which was then based in Hamburg, was an elderly man named George Riel. It is unknown how exactly he met Harold Oleksandr, but it happened. Moreover, despite the significant age difference, the men became true friends. Harold quickly became inspired by what George was preaching and often stayed alone with him, spending hours talking about God and playing the harmonium, which would later play its own role in this story. A harmonium is a musical instrument similar to a piano. Soon, Harold and his wife Tamara became full members of the society. The couple fit in perfectly, followed all the rules, and never missed a single meeting. Every word of George, the leader of the group, was perceived by them as a message directly sent from God. So they were really upset when they found out that Mr. Riel was dying. Especially Harold, who was with him until the end. Before his death, Riel told him that now he had to take on the responsibilities of a leader. Did the dying man really say that? It's unknown, but in any case, none of the community members were against that decision. So in the end, Harold Oleksandr became the new leader of the society. At first, the man's sermons were not much different from what could previously be heard from his mentor. But with each new meeting, he became more confident in himself and soon began adding his own ideas to the sermons. This was, so to speak, a new interpretation of Lorber's works. In particular, Harold claimed that he had found confirmation that a new prophet was about to be born very soon. He didn't know exactly when, but he assured that he would feel it and warn everyone when it happened. And that over time, this story, this so-called heavenly message, has evolved. For example, Harold said that the society must provide him, the prophet, with full support in all his actions and desires. Even if at first glance they might seem wrong, strange, or something like that to someone, after all, in fact, it will be the will of the Almighty. Around this time, a child was born in the family of Harold and Tamara, a girl named Marina. The parents were truly happy about the new addition, but not as much as they were for their second child, a boy who was born 2 years later. They named him Frank. Only after taking the baby in his arms did Harold tell his wife, and later all the members of the community, that this was the new prophet. Yes, what a surprise! Warming up the audience with endless sermons paid off. Not a single member of the community doubted that their leader's son was truly the new prophet. Despite the fact that a year later, Oleksandr and his wife had 2 more daughters, twins Petra and Sabina, Frank still remained the favorite. In fact, the boy grew up as if he were the only child in the family. He was always surrounded by an atmosphere of love and adoration, and he was really allowed to do anything, both at home and at society gatherings, where, by the way, people prayed to him as if he were God. Both members of the community and members of the family. They were all convinced that Frank was truly the Son of God. With each passing year, the boy became more and more aware of his power. When he was 7, he was already using it to the fullest, especially when it came to his mother or sisters. Frank from Malco didn't like women and considered them sinners just because. However, around the age of 16, nature started to take its course. And the young prophet scratched that tyrant became very interested in intimate relationships. Thoughts about women, whom he hadn't liked since childhood, just wouldn't leave his mind. It was unbearable for him and had to lead to something. And it did. Into complete chaos. So Frank couldn't build relationships with anyone outside Lorber's circle. After all, let me remind you, the boy was raised from childhood knowing that everything living outside their community was pure sin. That's why he decided not to sin and to explore this strange new world of earthly pleasures, which, by the way, other parishioners were advised to give up, with his sisters and mother. And yes, you understood everything correctly. I hope YouTube didn't. But just in case, you can support the channel on Patreon or become a sponsor on YouTube so I have the means to make new episodes. Thank you. When Frank shared his plans with his father, he supported him. The Son of God must decide for himself what is right and wrong. It's worth noting that Harold did not view himself as God. His sisters and mother were not against it either. All this was done so that the young prophet would not taint himself with relationships with evil. Theoretically, someone from the community could have become his partner, since there were women there. Why this didn't happen is unknown. In any case, what happened, happened. Despite the beliefs and lifestyle of the Oleksandr family, they still went out of the house. And in general, from the outside, in the eyes of society, they seemed like absolutely ordinary, decent people. Until a certain moment. One day after school, one of the younger sisters started complaining to her friend that Frank, you see, more often chooses another sister for love, and she would like to get more of his attention for herself. Kids are bad at keeping secrets, so within a day the whole school knew about it. In 2 days the students' parents knew, and after some time the Hamburg police became interested as well. Rumors tend to get embellished with new details with every additional pair of ears that hears them. So by that time, the police station was already convinced that Harold Oleksandr was the leader of a mysterious satanic cult, and at the same time a sexual offender who was doing who knows what with children, not just his own. The situation was spiraling. Even community members began whispering about Frank's relationship with his relatives. However, they didn't react to it the way he would have wanted. The very idea that the person they prayed to could be involved in such unheard of indecency with his own mother shocked them. That was already too much. Harold felt the atmosphere around the family becoming more and more tense and decided to act decisively and quickly. First of all, he informed the members of the society that he was no longer their leader. Secondly, he arranged for the family's move to Spain. In just a couple of weeks, they settled in a small apartment in the city of Santa Cruz in the Canary Islands. In their new place, they tried to live a normal life and not attract unnecessary attention. However, their worship of frank and strange prayer rituals did not go away. Considering that no one in the family was a member of the Lorber society anymore, it can be concluded that these were purely their personal, religious, or other beliefs. They truly believed in the divinity of Frank. But as it soon turned out, if there was anything otherworldly about this boy, it did not come from heaven, but from the very depths of hell. December 22, 1970. It was on this day that the crime of the century took place. After lunch, Tamara and Harold decided to lie down in bed to get some rest. At that moment, Frank was in another room, but he could still see his parents perfectly from there. For a moment, his eyes met Tamara's eyes, and Frank didn't like her look at all. Later, the boy himself says that his mother looked at him with contempt, not the way a woman should look at a prophet. And that's why he took a wooden hanger in his hands and announced the start of the killing hour. This was a ritual that had nothing to do with the works of Jacob Lorber and was 100% the product of the sick mind of Frank Alexander. He invented it back when the family lived in Hamburg. So what is its essence? Since, according to the young man's personal beliefs, all women were sinners by nature, the only way for them to get to heaven was through a painful death. Frank informed the family that when he received a revelation, he would announce the hour of the killing. At that hour, all the women who were in the house at that moment would be sent to heaven in the aforementioned way. Frank did not know exactly when this revelation would come to him. Maybe today or maybe in 10 years. In any case, no one in the family was against it. Everyone knew that someday this day, this hour would come. So, when on December 22, 1970, the boy started hitting his mother with a coat hanger, she just took a more comfortable position, so it would be easier for her son to send her to heaven. At that very moment, Frank Harold's father jumped out of bed and ran out of the room. He hurried to the harmonium, the very same one that he inherited from the former leader of the society. Harold sat down at it and joyfully began to play music. Frank's sisters, 15-year-old Petra and 18-year-old Marina, ran toward all this commotion. The third sister, Sabina, was not at home at that time, as she had recently started working as a maid for the local doctor and had been living at his place for several days. That very same Walter Trankler I mentioned at the beginning of the story. The frightened girls looked at Frank's mother and froze in place. Without taking his eyes off the game, the father turned his head to her and said,
"It's all right, girls. The very hour has come. Don't worry. You're next."
Petra and Marina knew about the ritual. They knew the rules, so they calmed down and just sat on the floor waiting for their turn. After a while, Frank came out of his mother's room and immediately, without hesitation, started beating his sisters. He kept doing it until they collapsed to the ground unconscious. However, Frank didn't know whether the girls and their mother were already dead. He had never performed ritual killings before, and it turned out to be a much more difficult task than he could have imagined. Maybe they just lost consciousness. In any case, the would-be prophet wasn't going to stop. On the contrary, he went to the kitchen, took a knife and a hammer and finished off his victims. After that, he used the knife to cut off the genitals of 7 women and nailed them to the wall. All this time, Harold just kept playing the harmonium. It was truly a hellish scene. The man only stopped when Frank asked for help. Together, they cut out Dagmara's heart and nailed it to the wall, right next to what was already there. Then, tired but happy and completely covered in blood, father and son started singing songs and running around the house. They were celebrating what they believed was the girls and their mother finally making it to heaven. However, for some reason, Franka and Harold didn't want to spend the night at the scene of the crime. Instead, they spent the night in another apartment that the family had purchased not long before. The next day, the father and son knocked on Dr. Trankler's door. When he called Sabina, they told her right at the door what they had done to her sisters and mother. That's exactly what the doctor heard. And when he peeked out the door, expecting Sabina to be just as shocked, she simply took her father's hand, pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And what Trankler first thought was dirt on Harold's hands turned out to be blood. While the police were on their way to the doctor's house, the Oleksandr family, or what was left of it, continued to passionately discuss the events of the previous day. Moreover, they told the cops everything without fear when they arrived. Frank and Harold had no intention of hiding the crime. On the contrary, in fact. It seemed like they were proud of coin and didn't understand what they were being accused of. That same day, the police searched the infamous family's apartment and took Harold and Frank into custody. During the investigation, the court psychiatrist declared both of them insane. At the hearing, Frank was outraged by the way people treated him. He was clearly not used to that. The expression on his face in this photo speaks for itself. The father and son were sent to a psychiatric hospital for compulsory treatment. Sabina, the only girl in the family who survived, begged to be taken with them, but she was refused. What happened to her afterwards is unknown. For the next 20 years, Harold and Frank never regretted Proskoin and continued to claim that only because of their actions did Petra, Marina and Dagmara make it to heaven. In 1990, both of them managed to escape from the hospital and they were never found. If Frank Oleksandr is still alive. He should be around 68 years old now. Who knows, maybe he could have moved to another country, maybe even settled in a small town and worked at a hospital, I don't know, maybe bought a girl's fate and lived with her for many years. By the way, about that, United States of America, Florida, Key West, October 1940. A young woman named Florinda Hoyos stopped her car near the house of Karl Tanzler, a local radiologist. She wasn't sure if the owner was home, but seeing the silhouette of a man waltzing with someone in the window, she resolutely walked to the door and knocked. At that moment, the music coming from the house stopped. But no one opened the door. Florinda knocked again and again because she knew that Karl, or at least someone, was home and she wasn't going to leave empty-handed. After a while, the door opened and in the small gap appeared the face of Mr. Tanzler. He wasn't expecting anyone and was clearly annoyed by the woman's appearance. After a formal greeting, he immediately asked her to leave. And when she asked him to return what supposedly belonged to her family, he said he had no time for idle talk and started closing the door. But at that moment, through the gap, Mrs. Coys saw a woman sitting in a chair behind Karl. And even though it simply couldn't be, she was sure that it was her own sister sitting there. The very sister she had personally buried 9 years ago. In a few days, the whole country would be talking about what happened in Tanzler's house. Some people would be scared to death, while others would be incredibly moved. But what exactly happened, and why? To answer these questions, we'll have to go back to the very beginning. Karl Tanzler was born in 1877 in Imperial Germany. He grew up and received his education in Dresden. According to the man himself, he began having a dream in his childhood that would periodically repeat throughout his entire life. In this dream, a woman would come to him, introducing herself as a distant relative who lived in the 17th century named Anna Constantia von Brockdorf. By the way, she was a real countess, also known as Anna Kozel. And later, after moving to the United States, Karl would also use the surname Kozel. Well, in that same group, at different periods of his life, he would introduce himself differently. So, Anna Kozel appeared out of utter emptiness and addressing Karl, said that she had to pass on to him the knowledge about the love of his entire life. After that, she appeared as the image of a young, beautiful woman with shiny black hair. Among other things, the relatives said that Karl not only had to find this girl, but what was much more important, he had to save her. Tanzler repeatedly told his friends and relatives about this dream, especially describing the beauty of true love that seemed to be waiting for him somewhere out there. However, no one, including Karl himself, took this story seriously. Dreams are just dreams, right? In any case, in 1920, Mr. Tanzler married Doris Schaefer, who, by the way, didn't even remotely resemble the girl from his dreams, but she truly loved him. Soon, the couple had an addition to their family, 2 beautiful daughters. The family lived happily together in Dresden, and everything was fine. Until things went wrong. Due to the economic crisis that Germany faced after World War I, and as a result, problems with employment, Tanzler and his family decided to migrate to the United States, which they did in 1926, moving to Florida, to a small town with a really tasty name, Zephyr Hills. Maybe the new scenery affected the couple's relationship, maybe it was stress, or maybe their love just wasn't real. Either way, just a year after the move, Karl leaves his wife and children and moves to the city of Key West. That's where he gets a job as an X-ray technician at the local hospital. After that, the man's life became a series of dull days filled only with work and sleep. One day replaced another, turning into weeks, months, and years. To say that Karl was unhappy would be an understatement. He had certain successes at work, but not enough to be remembered as an outstanding radiologist or anything like that. As for his personal life, it was even worse. After Doris, he never found a person with whom he could share not only a bed, but also joy and sorrow. During this same period, Karl had the same dream several more times about the same black-haired girl from his childhood. On April 22, 1930, a woman entered Tanzler's office looking for a radiologist for her daughter, who had recently been troubled by a severe cough. Nothing unusual, just a typical workday for Karl. Or rather, it was until 21-year-old Elena Hoyos, the very daughter who needed the X-ray, walked into the office. From the very first second, Karl knew that she was the one. The girl with black hair whom he had seen in his dreams all these years. For a few seconds, Karl just looked at Elena, not taking his eyes off her. All the other sounds in the room seemed to have been turned down to a minimum. One of those awkwardly uncomfortable situations when no one knows what to do. The silence was broken by the girl's mother's voice. She addressed Karl directly, asking if everything was all right and if he could help them. The man took the woman's hands in his and said he would do everything in his power to save Elena. The girl's mother was confused. She hadn't thought that her daughter needed to be saved. Who knows whether it was the dancer's years of experience that allowed him to see illness even without an X-ray, or if he just guessed. In any case, the scan showed that Elena was sick with tuberculosis. It's worth mentioning that before 1943 and the discovery of streptomycin, tuberculosis was a death sentence. So this news mentally just devastated the girl's family. No one expected her to be saved, they just asked how much time she had left. However, an absolute stranger to them, Karl Tanzler, was not going to give up just like that. He had just met the love of his life. And although this love wasn't even aware of his feelings, Karl became literally obsessed with saving the girl. And he really did everything he could. He used all his connections to help Elena. He took her to doctors, various procedures, pills, injections, all the experimental treatment methods that existed at that time. They tried everything. And often Karl paid for everything out of his own pocket since Elena's family was not wealthy. However, Karl himself was not wealthy either, but he gave absolutely everything he had for the chance to save the girl. Later, he even moved some X-ray equipment to her house to make it easier to undergo diagnostics, which they did over and over again, constantly checking for progress in her treatment. But there was none. Despite all their efforts, in the end, the illness won. About a year after Karl Tanzler first saw Elena Hoyos, she fell asleep for the last time in her parents' house. At that time, she was only 22 years old. Of course, the girl's family was very upset, but they had long come to terms with what was bound to happen. But Karl, he was simply devastated because until the very end, he believed he would be able to save Elena. However, the black-haired girl from his dreams died in real life. And along with her, something inside him died as well. Karl covered most of the expenses related to the farewell ceremony and even paid for the construction of a large stone mausoleum. It was built specifically for Elena. After the burial, Tanzler continued to visit it every day. More precisely, not just to it, but actually inside it. The thing is, the man had a key to the entrance, so every evening he would come to the cemetery, lock himself inside the mausoleum, and spend an hour or two by the coffin. What exactly he did there? Well, as Karl himself would later say, he talked to the deceased and she talked to him. One way or another, such behavior couldn't go unnoticed. Soon, the cemetery workers informed Elena's family that Mr. Tanzler was behaving strangely, and maybe they should do something about it. The girl's father and mother met with Karl to talk about it. But he immediately cut them off, saying something like how I deal with my grief is my own business. And as strange as this whole story seemed, there was nothing forbidden about it, at least according to the laws of the state of Florida. Besides, Karl really did a lot for their daughter, so the parents decided not to bring up this topic anymore. And Karl decided to continue visiting the mausoleum almost every day. That's how the next 2 years passed. One evening in 1933, he came to the cemetery as usual, but this time he brought a baby carriage with him. He needed it to take the late Elena to the mansion, to his own mansion. Which is exactly what he did. Afterwards, at home, he connected the girl's bones with wire, stuffed what was left of her with rags, inserted glass eyes, and with the help of wax and plaster, made what could be called a face. The hair was real, or more precisely, a wig made from Elena's real hair. Karl dressed her in different dresses, constantly updated her wardrobe, and used a lot of disinfectants, preservatives, and perfumes to get rid of the smell and preserve the remains of the body for as long as possible. You can download the photo from the Telegram channel. Let's find out now. The link is in the description. Subscribe there as well. So Karl started living with the body of the deceased as if she were alive. He talked to her, had meals, danced, and for the next 7 years he slept in the same bed. According to the doctors who were present at Elena's later examination, Karl engaged with her in what people in the world call love. The man did this using a special tube, which he supposedly inserted into the opening between her legs. However, it is impossible to verify the truth of these words. The doctors gave this testimony several decades after the events described. Although their names were in the case from the very beginning, maybe they just wanted to get some hype, who knows? In any case, the fact remains that Karl slept for 7 long years in bed with the corpse of the girl he once fell in love with. And it's not even known whether she reciprocated his feelings while she was alive. Although after death, of course, it's a different story. The saying, silence means consent, takes on a new meaning in this story. In short, it was a real obsession that Karl kept secret. In particular, that's why he kept visiting the empty mausoleums all this time, just so as not to arouse suspicion that there was no body there. It's unknown how long this could have continued if it weren't for the rumors. A lonely man nearing 50 periodically buys items from the women's wardrobe. And let me remind you, this was the early 40s, so such behavior raised questions. People had been whispering about Karl for a long time, but still, no one bothered him. Until someone accidentally saw through the window of his house how he was dancing with a corpse. So the rumors started to spread, and when they reached Florinda Hoyos, the sister of the deceased Elena, she began to wonder. It sounded absolutely wild and simply impossible, but if you just assumed that it was possible, whose body could it be? Florinda wanted to check the mausoleum where her sister was buried, but here's the thing. The only key to it was with the person who paid for its construction. You already know the rest. Florinda came to Karl and asked him to give her the key to the mausoleum. But Karl, of course, refused since it had been empty for many years. This made Florinda doubt whether everything was as it seemed. However, when she saw something resembling her sister behind Tanzler, all her doubts quickly disappeared. She knew it was Elena's body. Florinda immediately went to the police, and although they didn't have a warrant to search the house, Karl, cornered, confessed to everything almost right away. In the end, it was also a kind of relief. He had nothing left to hide. Because after that, the man willingly told them what he had been doing all these years. According to him, he tried to help Elena and still save her. In his opinion, if he managed to send her into the stratosphere, the radiation would have restored her body and the girl would be alive again. He even tried to prepare an old airplane to do this. However, of course, this did not happen, so Karl simply used it as a mobile laboratory for his experiments. After a psychiatric evaluation, Tanzler was found competent to stand trial despite all the bizarre things he had done. According to the doctors, he was a completely healthy, sane person, so he stood trial on charges of willfully and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body from it without proper authorization. However, after the preliminary hearing, the case was dismissed because the statute of limitations for this crime had long since expired. Elena's body was sent for autopsy and examination. The doctors were truly shocked. This doesn't happen every day, even in the world of pathologists. Not even every year. Maybe not even every 100 years. Afterwards, the body was displayed at Dean Lopez's funeral home, where more than 6,500 people came to see it. It was a real sensation. Tanzler's story remained on the front pages for a long time, not only in local but also in national publications. Surprisingly, many people were touched by Karl's story, considering it more romantic than horrifying. But, in my humble opinion, this is still absolute madness. The girl's remains were reburied at the cemetery in Key West. Only this time, in an unmarked grave, so that no one except her family could find her. And Mr. Tanzler, after the events described, moved again to Zephyr Hills and, by the way, settled not far from his former wife. Despite everything, they continued to maintain a good relationship. However, Karl's heart belonged to Lena. By the way, in 1947, he published an autobiography in the magazine Fantastic Adventures, where he described his experience of living with her corpse. Well, those adventures are truly fantastic. And although the man could no longer keep that same Elena at home using her death mask, he still made a mannequin of her, which he lived with until July 3rd, 1952, the day of his death. Something like that. Although Karl was not able to save the girl, at least he lived to old age and wasn't eaten by his neighbor. Yeah. By the way, about that. Country. City of St. Petersburg, March 2015. At first glance, the 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova, who seems unremarkable, starts renovating her apartment. Renting out a room was her only way to make a living. The woman didn't work anywhere, lived alone, and didn't have many friends. She was only more or less close with her neighbor, who, upon hearing about the renovation, or maybe even hearing the renovation itself, decided to offer Tamara her help. And not physical help, but rather, let's say, of a communicative nature. She introduced Samsonova to Valentina Ulanova, who lived in the neighboring building at 10 Dimitrova Street. And this acquaintance ended badly for both of them. In fact, for one of them it wasn't just bad, it was fatal. Valentina Ulanova was already 79 and age was taking its toll. Everyday housework was getting harder for her with each passing day. In addition, the pensioner like Samsonova lived alone. So a mutual acquaintance of Valentina and Tamara suggested an idea to the women to move in together for the period while Samsonova's apartment was being renovated. Tamara would take on some of the responsibilities like helping with cleaning and cooking, and Valentina wouldn't charge her rent. There would always be someone to talk to, benefiting everyone. After a short conversation, both agreed to move in together. Surprisingly, the women quickly understood each other. They didn't have any household quarrels or any quarrels at all, in fact. On the contrary, they lived in perfect harmony. Neighbors frequently spotted them together, often in an intoxicated state. Maybe that was their secret. I've heard that in those parts, having a bottle in the apartment means a lot to people. And not just in the apartment either. When, after several months, the renovation of Samsonova's apartment was finished and it was time to say goodbye, she decided not to do it. Tamara really enjoyed living with Ulanova. A mention of this would later be found in her personal diary, in which, it must be said, she made full use of her linguistic education. The diary was kept in Russian, English, and German. But no matter how much Tamara liked the new place, it still wasn't her own apartment. Moreover, lately, Ulanova had started to get tired of constant company. The woman hadn't expected that Samsonova would continue living here even after the renovation. They hadn't agreed on this or even discussed it, so Valentina asked the tenant to move out. At first, these were just hints like, well, it was nice, but now it's time to say goodbye. However, Samsonova just joked about it. I really don't want to leave Dimitrova 10, we lived together so well. It felt so homey, you could say, just like home. And she didn't move out. After a couple of days, Ulanova realized that Tamara was serious and started telling her directly to get out. Samsonova in turn also started speaking openly. She stated that she would stay in the apartment as long as she considered necessary. I don't know why Ulanova didn't call the cops. Maybe it was because over the past couple of months, the woman had really grown close to her tenant and didn't want to end the relationship that way. One way or another, Samsonova continued living in the apartment, and the tension between the women kept growing every day. Everything was resolved on July 22, 2015. During yet another argument, Ulanova lost her temper so much that Tamara finally understood. Things couldn't go on like this any longer. The woman agreed to leave the apartment. But before that, she asked to spend one last evening together so they could part as friends on a good note. Ulanova hesitated but agreed. Tamara smiled, got dressed, and went to the store to buy some food for dinner, including Olivier salad, which Ulanova loved so much. And something else. After returning home, Samsonova behaved politely and immediately started setting the table. The dinner went well. The friends talked, joked, and enjoyed the food. All misunderstandings were forgotten. About an hour later, Tamara, in a good mood, went to her room to sleep while Ulanova stayed in the kitchen to spend a little more time alone. A few hours later, during the night of July 22 to 23, Samsonova returned to the kitchen and found Valentina on the floor. She was dead. Most likely. It's impossible to say for sure. In any case, Samsonova wasn't surprised. In fact, that's exactly what she expected. The thing is, in the store-bought Olivier salad, which by the way only Ulanova ate, Tamara added 50 crushed tablets of a strong sleeping pill, which was impossible to get without a prescription. But there was another way. You could slip a couple of extra rubles into the pharmacist's pocket. That's exactly how the woman got what she came for. So, when Tamara saw Ulanova on the floor, she immediately got to work. She took out a knife, a saw, and began, let's say, to dismember her friend. First, she got rid of her head, then split the body in half, took out the lungs, and sawed off the limbs. She put all of this into bags, wrapped some parts in a shower curtain, put the head in a pot, and took everything out of the house in several trips. Valentina, or rather what was left of her, simply in bags, was scattered by Tamara near a nearby lake. All the body parts were nearby, except for the head, which was in the pot a bit further away near the local school, and the lungs, which would never be found. In fact, Ulanova's body was within a radius of just 200 meters from her own apartment, that is, the crime scene and the place where Tamara Samsonova lived. However, for 3 whole days, no one paid any attention to either the trash or the pot. Only on July 26 was the content of the bags discovered by a local resident, or more precisely, by her dog. Then there was a call to the cops, a search of the area, and near the school, they found that same pot with the same head inside. Thanks to this, the victim was identified. When the police knocked on Ulanova's door, Tamara immediately opened it and greeted them. At first, she pretended not to know anything about her friend's death, as if it was a real shock to her, and she didn't want to let the cops into her home. However, she had no right to stay in the deceased's apartment, let alone prevent those investigating the owner's murder from entering. The missing shower curtain and traces of blood on the knives raised strong suspicions among the cops. But their suspicions were quickly dispelled. The surveillance footage from the entrance clearly showed Samsonova carrying out those same bags and the same pot. Realizing there was nowhere left to run, Tamara confessed to everything. But this was only the beginning. During the investigation, it turned out that the woman could be guilty of at least 10 more murders. Most of the victims were missing tenants who rented a room from her. Samsonova immediately confessed to some of the murders herself. According to her, the first victim was a young man to whom she rented a room back in 2003. The pattern was similar. Sleeping pills were added and dismemberment took place in the bathtub, in which Tamara would bathe again just a day later. And not just her, but many tenants in the future as well. That same year, the police did indeed find some body parts of a man. However, let's just say not all of them, so his identity couldn't be established. And although Samsonova recalled a tattoo on the arm that matched the one described by the investigators in the case, it wasn't enough for a conviction. By the way, Samsonova started renting out her room back in 2001 after her husband left her a year earlier. Or did he? After all, no one has seen him since that year. The woman kept changing her statements about his disappearance. At one point, she said he left home and just never came back. Then she claimed he had died of cirrhosis. It's unknown what really happened, but during the investigation, his documents, including his passport, were found in her apartment, which of course doesn't look good for her. But even here, it was impossible to prove that Tamara was the one who killed him, or even if he was killed at all. Despite the woman's confessions to other murders, she always denied any involvement in the man's disappearance. There is also mention of a certain Vladimir, who rented a room from Samsonova. Back in 2001, the tenant was 20 years younger than her. However, despite this, their relationship quickly became intimate. And everything was fine until Vladimir decided to end their relationship. Soon after that, he went to the hospital with severe symptoms of poisoning of unknown origin. After being saved and discharged from the hospital, the man promptly moved out from Samsonova. Perhaps that's why he's still alive. He may no longer be alive, given the recent issues they've been facing in that region. In short, in the end, Tamara was charged with only one murder, specifically that of Valentina Ulanova. After all, as they say, no body, no case. At the trial, Samsonova's testimony was inconsistent. At first, she was happy that she had been caught, clapping her hands, blowing kisses to everyone, and even said she wanted to live in prison. But why do you think that is? Well, I want to live in prison. Then, on the contrary, she said she wasn't guilty of anything, that it was some kind of mistake. They even tried to shift the blame onto their neighbor, another one. But she wasn't even in the city at that time. As for the verdict, Samson was diagnosed with schizophrenia, so instead of prison, he was sent to a hospital. How many actual victims she had is unknown, just like why she needed Olenova's lungs. And did she remove them from anyone else? When asked if she could have eaten them, the investigator replied, "It can't be ruled out." Tamara neither denied nor confirmed it. Maybe the answer is in her diary, which the woman kept next to esoteric literature and various rituals and ceremonies. In it, among other things, she described the murders, but we don't have access to those records. So this will remain a mystery. What's your theory? Write it in the comments. Dear ones, if you've watched up to this moment, know that you are the best. Let me remind you that this channel exists solely thanks to your support. Any comment, like, and especially a repost, are important. It directly depends on you how many people will see this video and whether I can earn enough for a new episode. If you're interested, roughly 100,000 views bring me about $150. Find the link to support the channel financially in the description. Join in. Thank you to all the sponsors and patrons who have already done this. It means a lot to me. But remember, always donate to the armed forces of Ukraine first. That's all for today. This was Sasha on the Blogmeister channel. Armister, I got it.